Picture London, 1888. November rain turning the streets to black mirrors. Hansom cabs splashing through puddles, their wheels cutting brown arcs through the gaslight. Steam rises from the iron grates in the pavement, not from the rain, but from something below. Something always running, always warm, always moving beneath your feet. Now follow that steam down. Through the grate, past the first layer of brickwork, slick with condensation, into a corridor that smells like wet stone and iron oxide and something faintly organic, not sewage exactly, but the smell of a city's breath, concentrated and trapped. The walls here are hand-laid brick, each one placed by someone whose name nobody recorded. The mortar between them has darkened with moisture over decades until it's almost black. This is a steam tunnel, built in 1882. 6 years old when you descend into it, but it already feels ancient because darkness ages everything differently. Walk deeper. The sound changes. Your footsteps echo, but not cleanly. They're absorbed by the humidity, by the constant whisper of water moving through pipes you can't see. Somewhere ahead, there's a junction where 3 tunnels meet. One carries steam to heat a hospital 3 blocks away. Another routes fresh water from a reservoir 10 miles north. The third, nobody's quite sure anymore. It was dug in 1871, before proper municipal records. There's a brass plate on the wall, green with verdigris. Whitecapel District Water Authority, Section 7B, depth 22 feet. Someone filed a report about this tunnel in 1883, describing how maintenance workers had to crawl through a collapsed section on hands and knees for 30 yards, with water to their elbows. The report is stored in the London Metropolitan Archives now. I read it last year. The handwriting is beautiful, careful copperplate script, describing absolute misery. This was the invisible world cities needed before anything else could happen. Before electric lights, before telephones, before subway trains, before any of the things we think of as infrastructure, there had to be this. Networks of hand-dug passages carrying the things that kept people from dying: water, drainage, heat. But here's what they don't tell you in school. These tunnels weren't just functional. They became something stranger. A second city, built in reverse, not rising up, but burrowing down. Not for people to see, but for people to survive. And the men who built them, they left almost nothing behind except the tunnels themselves. Everyone knows about the London Underground. The world's first passenger subway, 1863, steam locomotives pulling wooden cars through tunnels beneath the city. It's in every history book. But almost nobody talks about what was already down there. Starting around 1840, cities began digging tunnels for things that weren't trains. Pipes mostly. Gas lines to feed the new street lamps. Water mains to replace wells that had become contaminated. Steam pipes to heat factories and offices. These tunnels were dug by hand, pickaxes and shovels, sometimes in clay so thick it had to be cut like cheese, sometimes in waterlogged gravel that collapsed without warning. Take the New York Croton aqueduct system. Built in the 1840s, it included underground distribution tunnels beneath Manhattan, brick-lined chambers tall enough to stand in, running for miles beneath the streets. Workers dug them using a technique called shaft and drift mining. Sink a vertical shaft every few hundred feet, then dig horizontally in both directions until the tunnels met in the middle. At night, you could stand at street level and hear the hammering from below, echoing up through the access shafts. A foreman named Michael Byrne kept a diary in 1847. Most of it is routine measurements, progress reports. But there's one entry from August where he describes taking a new worker into the tunnel for the first time. He asked how deep we were. I told him 28 feet. He looked at the ceiling, all that earth and stone, and said he could feel the weight of the street pressing down. I told him not to think about it, but I think about it every day. The air in these tunnels was terrible, not just stale, chemically wrong. Early gas lines leaked constantly. Workers carried candles or oil lanterns because batteries didn't exist yet, but open flames in gas-filled tunnels killed people. The solution? They didn't have one. They just worked faster and hoped. A report from the Philadelphia Gas Works in 1854 describes how workers would test air quality by observing candle flame behavior. If the flame turned blue-green or went out, they were supposed to evacuate. But deadlines were tight, and tunnel collapses waited for no one. So men worked in bad air until they got headaches that lasted for days. The water systems were almost worse. Before modern pumps, distribution relied on gravity and pressure. That meant tunnels had to follow precise gradients, usually just a few inches of drop per 100 feet. Get the angle wrong and water stagnates. Get it too steep and the flow erodes the pipe. Workers navigated these labyrinths with string lines and plumb bobs, sometimes crawling through passages barely wider than their shoulders, checking connections by feel in absolute darkness. And the wooden water conduits, nobody talks about these anymore, but they were everywhere in the 1850s and 60s. Hollowed-out logs, fitted together end-to-end, running through brick tunnels. They sagged in the humidity. They rotted from the inside. They cracked when the temperature dropped. A superintendent in Boston wrote in 1866 that his repair crews spent more time replacing old conduit than laying new pipe. The work never ended. The tunnels were always wet, always collapsing, always needing someone to crawl inside and fix what had broken. There's a story I found in the archives of the Brooklyn Water Department, 1873. A fitter named James Donnelly went into a tunnel beneath Atlantic Avenue to repair a joint that had failed. The tunnel was 4 feet high. He had to crouch the whole way. His supervisor noted in the log that Donnelly had been underground for 6 hours when they realized the water pressure was dropping. They sent someone in after him. He'd gotten turned around in the dark. These tunnels branched and crossed without signage, and had spent 2 hours crawling in the wrong direction, deeper into a section that hadn't been mapped yet. They found him sitting in water up to his chest, lamp oil exhausted, waiting in the dark because he didn't know which way to go. That was the job. That was ordinary. The men who maintained these systems weren't miners, exactly, though the work was similar. They weren't construction workers, though they built and rebuilt constantly. They were something else, a category of labor that emerged with industrial cities and then gradually disappeared from public consciousness. They were called tunnel men or underground fitters, or sometimes just the night crew, because a lot of the work happened after dark when street traffic was lighter and water pressure was lower. Think about what that meant physically. Spending 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours in darkness. Not the darkness of a room where your eyes adjust, the darkness of 20 feet of earth and brick above you, with maybe a candle or a battery lamp that throws a weak yellow circle of light that makes the shadows seem deeper. The temperature in steam tunnels could hit 95, 100 degrees. In winter, condensation formed on every surface. Your clothes never dried. There's a medical report from the New York Department of Public Works, 1889. It describes health complaints common among tunnel workers. Chronic coughs from inhaling brick dust and coal smoke, joint pain from constant moisture, vision problems from working by dim light, and something they called tunnel ear, a condition where your hearing becomes hypersensitive to low-frequency sounds because you're constantly listening for the echo of dripping water, the creak of settling stone, the hiss of a gas leak. These men developed a kind of spatial intuition that's hard to explain. William Hart, who worked as a steam fitter in Boston from 1877 to 1901, gave an interview late in his life where he described being able to tell which tunnel he was in by the way water sounds when it hits the floor. Different brick patterns created different echo patterns. Different depths had different pressure in your ears. After a few years underground, Hart said, "You could close your eyes and know exactly where you were, same as a man knows his own house in the dark." But the physical toll was real. Tunnel collapses were common, not catastrophic usually, but slow failures where ceiling bricks started to sag, mortar crumbling, and you had maybe 30 seconds to move before half a ton of masonry came down. A supervisor in Philadelphia kept a log of incidents. in 1882. That year alone, 17 sealing failures, 9 gas leaks requiring evacuation, 4 flooding events, and 1 case where a worker got lost in an unmapped section for 11 hours. The worst part, several workers said in interviews decades later, wasn't the danger. It was the isolation. You went down into these tunnels alone or with maybe one other person. No radio communication. No way to call for help except to physically walk back to the nearest access shaft and shout up. So you worked in silence or near silence, just the sound of your own breathing and the constant whisper of water moving through pipes. There's a remarkable document in the Chicago Municipal Archives, a collection of letters written by tunnel workers to the Department of Public Works between 1885 and 1895. Most are complaints about wages or working conditions, but a few are stranger. One worker, signing only as JK, wrote in 1891, describing how he'd started talking to himself underground, not from madness, but because the silence feels dangerous, as though if I don't make sound, I'll disappear. Another wrote about how he'd begun to smell things that weren't there, coffee brewing, bread baking, and realized his mind was inventing sensory detail because the tunnels offered so little. And yet they kept going back, because the city needed them, because the alternative was water that didn't flow, gas that didn't light, steam that didn't heat. Every building above ground depended on these men doing work nobody saw. A fitter named Thomas Bynes, interviewed in 1920 about his years working in New York's underground in the 1880s, said something I think about often. People walked over my head every day, thousands of them. They never knew I was down there. When the lights came on in their houses, when the radiators got warm, when water came out of the tap, they never thought about how it got there. We were invisible, but we made it all possible. By the 1890s, the underground had become a network so complex that no single person understood all of it. Different companies owned different systems. The gas company had tunnels, the water department had tunnels, the new electric companies had tunnels, the telephone and telegraph companies had tunnels. They crossed over and under each other. They shared access shafts, but not maps. It was a layered city, built without a blueprint. Let me give you a sense of how complicated this got. In 1893, Chicago hosted the World's Fair. The White City, electric lights, elevated trains, the first Ferris wheel. Everyone remembers what was above ground. But beneath the fairgrounds, there was a network of utility tunnels nearly as large as the exhibition halls. Steam pipes to heat the buildings, water mains, drainage culverts, electrical conduits. A newspaper reporter went down into them and wrote that it was like walking through the veins of some vast organism. Everywhere, the sound of flowing, humming, the sense of power moving through confined spaces. That's what cities had become. The streets were just the skin. Everything vital happened below. Water distribution is a good example of how these systems worked. In most cities by 1890, water came from a distant reservoir, flowed through large mains buried deep, then distributed through smaller pipes at shallower depths. But maintaining pressure required reservoirs built into the underground network itself, brick chambers, sometimes 2 stories tall, that held thousands of gallons as a buffer against demand spikes. Workers called them cisterns, or holding vaults. Some were dry spaces with pipes running through. Others were flooded, accessible only by boat. There's a photograph in the Boston Water Department archives from 1895 showing 2 workers in a rowboat inside a brick vault beneath Beacon Hill. The vault is maybe 40 feet across, ceiling lost in darkness above the lamp's reach. The water is perfectly still. The men are checking a valve assembly that controls flow to 6 different neighborhoods. If that valve fails, parts of the city lose water pressure. But the only way to access it is to row across this underground lake. Steam networks were even stranger. By the 1880s, several cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, had begun building centralized steam heating systems. A single powerhouse would generate steam, and a network of insulated pipes would distribute it to offices and apartments blocks away. The pipes ran through tunnels, But they also needed expansion joints, places where the pipe could flex as it heated and cooled. These joints leaked. Not catastrophically, but constantly, filling the tunnels with fog. Workers who maintained steam systems said you sometimes couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. You navigated by touch, by memory, by the sound of the pipes. A maintenance supervisor in New York wrote in 1897 about a problem they discovered that year. The steam tunnels beneath Midtown had created their own climate. The heat from the pipes, combined with groundwater seepage, had raised the temperature of the surrounding earth by 15–20 degrees. Tree roots from Central Park had grown down into the tunnels, drawn by the warmth. They had to bring in workers to hack the roots away from pipe insulation. One worker said the roots were as thick as your arm and had wrapped around some pipes so tightly they deformed the metal. The telegraph and telephone systems added another layer. Starting in the 1870s, communication wires began moving underground in major cities, partly for aesthetics, partly because storms kept knocking down overhead lines. But these cables generated heat when in use, and they couldn't be buried directly or they'd short out from moisture. So companies built cable vaults, brick chambers lined with wooden racks that held hundreds or thousands of individual wires. The vaults had to be ventilated, but they also had to be dry, so engineers designed them with gratings that opened to storm drains, using the airflow from the sewer system to cool the cables. This is not something you design on purpose. It emerged through accumulated improvisation, each system adapting to the systems already down there. Workers told stories about places where all these systems intersected. There was a junction beneath Broadway and Canal Street in New York where 5 different tunnels met: water, steam, gas, telephone, and sewer. A fitter named Patrick O'Brien, who worked there in the 1890s, described it in an interview decades later. You'd go down there, and it was like standing inside a machine. Everything humming, dripping, clicking. The steam pipe would sing when pressure changed. The telephone cables would crackle with static. Water in the sewer would echo up from below. You could hear the whole city breathing. Cities also started using underground spaces for things other than utilities. During harsh winters, valve houses and pump rooms became unofficial shelters for homeless men who knew how to access them. A social reformer in Chicago documented this in 1894, describing how certain steam tunnels had become subterranean refuges where men sleep on the warm brick floor, preferring the danger of gas poisoning to the certainty of freezing. And there were spaces nobody planned at all, voids left when construction methods changed, chambers dug for projects that were abandoned, tunnels that connected to nothing anymore. A civil engineer in Philadelphia wrote in 1899 about discovering a brick corridor beneath Market Street that didn't appear on any map. It was 15 feet below street level, 6 feet high, running for 200 feet before ending at a wall. No one knew who built it or why. His theory was that it had been dug in the 1840s as part of an early water system, then forgotten when newer pipes were laid at different depths. By the turn of the century, some cities started trying to map all this. Boston created a Department of Underground Coordination in 1902. Their job was to compile information from gas companies, water departments, electric utilities, everyone who had tunnels, and create a master map. It took them 7 years. The final map was 16 feet long and showed over 300 miles of tunnels, vaults, and conduits beneath the city, and it was incomplete. There were tunnels nobody remembered building, chambers that had been sealed decades earlier, whole networks of early gas and water infrastructure that had been abandoned in place, too expensive to fill in, so they just stayed down there, empty and dark. This was the hidden foundation of modern urban life, not glamorous, not visible, but absolutely necessary. The city above couldn't exist without the city below. By 1910, the underground had taken on a strange kind of permanence. It wasn't just infrastructure anymore. It was architecture, brick corridors with decades of patina, chambers with their own acoustics, junctions where workers had chalked directions on the walls because there was no other way to navigate. Some of these spaces were enormous. The water distribution vault beneath Croton Reservoir in New York was 90 feet across, 2 stories tall, with brick columns supporting a ceiling that held up half of Central Park. Workers called it the Cathedral. It was never meant to be seen by anyone except maintenance crews, but the engineering firm that designed it in 1872 gave it architectural details anyway: carved keystones, corbels at the column tops. Someone decided that even though this space would spend its entire existence in darkness, it should be beautiful. That impulse to treat underground spaces with dignity showed up in a lot of places. Manhole covers weren't just functional, they were decorative, cast with the name of the city, the date, sometimes floral patterns. Access shafts had iron ladders with handrails worn smooth by thousands of hands. Junction chambers sometimes had glazed tile on the walls, not for waterproofing, but because someone thought it looked better than raw brick. The workers who spent their lives down there developed their own culture. There's a collection of photographs taken in 1905 by a newspaper reporter who convinced a group of steam fitters in Boston to let him document their work. The photos show men in canvas jackets, faces streaked with soot, sitting in a valve house during their break. They've scratched their names into the brick wall behind them. Someone's drawn a picture of a pipe wrench. There's a shelf with coffee cups, a newspaper, a lunch pail. It's a workspace, but it's also a place where people spent time, where they existed. Oral histories from workers in this period describe how you could tell who had been underground for years by the way they moved. They walked slightly hunched even on the surface, because you learned to keep your head down in low tunnels. They developed a habit of running their hand along walls, even when there was plenty of light, because you navigated so often by touch. And they all said the same thing about coming up after a long shift. The surface world felt too bright, too loud, too open. But by this time, the underground was about to change again. The first electric subways were being built: London, Paris, New York, Boston. These weren't just new tunnels, they were passenger spaces, designed to be seen, lit, navigated by the public. And they required much larger excavations, deeper boreholes, more complex engineering. What's interesting is how much the subway engineers depended on the knowledge of the older tunnel workers. When they were planning the New York subway in the 1890s, the Engineering Commission hired dozens of men who'd spent years maintaining the older utility tunnels. These workers knew where the ground was stable, where there were underground springs, where old foundations might cause problems. A report from 1899 describes how one steam fitter pointed out a location where they were planning a subway station and said, "You'll hit water at 18 feet. I know because I've been crawling through it for 10 years. They dug. He was right. The old utility tunnels stayed in place, of course. The subways were built around them, over them, through them in some cases. This created even more complexity. Now you had tunnels for trains, tunnels for utilities, tunnels for pedestrian access, tunnels for maintenance, all layered on top of each other. In some parts of New York, there are 7 distinct levels of underground construction. Street level, then shallow utilities, then steam and water mains, then subway tunnels, then deeper water tunnels, then the foundations of skyscrapers, then bedrock. And the old workers kept going down. Even as the underground became more regulated, more mapped, more visible, there were still miles of forgotten infrastructure that needed maintenance. Tunnels dug in the 1840s were still carrying water in the 1920s. Steam pipes laid in the 1880s were still heating buildings in the 1950s. These systems didn't fail because someone kept them running. Someone crawled through them with a wrench and a lamp. Someone repaired the leaks. Someone knew the way. There's a last story I want to tell. In 1938, a city inspector in London was surveying damage from a water main break beneath Fleet Street. He descended into the repair site and noticed an opening in the tunnel wall, not a crack, but an intentional passage. He followed it. It led to another tunnel, older, brick starting to crumble, running perpendicular to the modern water main. This tunnel wasn't on any map. He walked for 100 feet, found a junction where 3 more tunnels met, and then saw something strange. A wooden sign, hand-lettered nailed to the brick. It said, North Road, 180 yards. The sign was from 1843. Someone, nearly a century earlier, had been down here with a hammer and nails and a piece of wood, trying to help future workers find their way. And it had stayed there in the dark, holding its message, waiting for someone who might need it. That's what the underground was. A city built by people who knew their work would never be seen, who left behind only the systems themselves, and occasionally, in the dark corners, small signs that they'd been there. Every city sits on foundations built by hands we'll never know. The brick tunnels beneath the streets, the vaults holding water, the corridors carrying steam and wire, and all the invisible things that keep the lights on, someone dug them. Someone crawled through them in the dark. Someone kept them running. The subway systems came later. They're what everyone remembers, the grand projects, the engineering marvels. But before the first train ever ran underground, there were decades of tunnels that made it possible. Water systems, steam networks, gas lines, telegraph cables, the infrastructure that held the city together. And the men who built it and maintained it left almost nothing behind except the tunnels themselves. No memorials, no plaques, hardly any photographs. Just miles of brick passage, still carrying water, still holding weight, still doing the work they were designed for more than a century ago. Modern life was first built down there, in the dark, by people who knew that everything above them, the lights, the heat, the water, the growing city, depended on what they did where no one could see them. So the next time you walk over a manhole cover, or see steam rising from a grate, or hear water moving somewhere beneath the street, remember that there's a second city down there, older than the one above, holding everything up. Built by unseen hands, working in darkness, so the world above could shine.